November 28, 1994. Inside the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was cleaning a prison bathroom. Within minutes, he would be dead, beaten with a metal bar by a fellow inmate. The man who had terrorized Milwaukee, who had taken 17 lives, met his end at the hands of another killer serving time. But Dahmer's death, that was far from the strangest ending on this list. 8 serial killers. 8 different deaths. Some faced the electric chair. Others died of old age in their cells. One was murdered behind bars, while another avoided execution through legal technicalities and lived into his 80s. A few got what many would call justice. Others seemed to escape it entirely. Ted Bundy smiled before they flipped the switch. Aileen Wuornos demanded her execution be carried out. And H.H. Holmes? He insisted they bury him in concrete, 10 feet deep, because he feared what might happen to his body after death. So here's the question. Which killer got the ending they deserved? And which ones cheated justice, even in death? Let me know in the comments what you think. Because today, we're covering exactly how every one of these killers took their last breath. January 24th, 1989. Florida State Prison. 7 a.m. Ted Bundy sat strapped to an electric chair nicknamed Old Sparky. Outside the prison walls, crowds gathered. Some held signs, others chanted. A few even tailgated, celebrating what they knew was coming. Inside, Bundy was minutes away from death. This was the man who had confessed to 30 murders across 7 states. Young women, most of them college students. He would approach them, sometimes faking an injury, asking for help. They trusted him. They shouldn't have. For over a decade, Bundy played games with the system. He defended himself in court, charming some observers, disturbing others. He escaped custody twice. The first time, he jumped from a courthouse window. The second time, he crawled through a ceiling vent in his cell. After that second escape, he made it all the way to Florida, where he broke into a sorority house and attacked 4 women in 15 minutes. 2 died. That attack in Tallahassee sealed his fate. But even on death row, Bundy kept playing. He offered to give details about unsolved murders in exchange for more time. He gave interviews. He blamed pornography for his crimes. Anything to delay the inevitable. It didn't work. At 7:06 a.m., 2,000 volts surged through his body. His hands clenched. Smoke rose from the electrode attached to his leg. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Theodore Robert Bundy was pronounced dead at 7:16 a.m. He was 42 years old. The crowd outside cheered. But here's what most people don't know. In his final days, Bundy finally started telling the truth. He spent hours with detectives, confessing to murders he'd never admitted before. He drew maps. He gave names. Some investigators believed he killed far more than 30 women. Maybe 50, maybe more. He took those numbers to the grave. 3 more killers on this list would face execution, but their paths to death, completely different from Bundy's. Before we continue, if you're finding this information as gripping as I do, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover cases like these every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. May 10, 1994, Stateville Correctional Center, Illinois, 12:58 a.m. John Wayne Gacy lay strapped to a gurney, waiting for the lethal injection that would end his life. Unlike Bundy, who had died 5 years earlier in the electric chair, Gacy would be the first person executed by lethal injection in Illinois. The state had switched methods, calling it more humane. Gacy didn't see it that way. This was the man known as the Killer Clown. He'd performed at children's parties and charity events dressed as Pogo the Clown. He seemed like a pillar of his community. He ran a construction business. He hosted neighborhood barbecues. Politicians posed for photos with him. But underneath his house in the Chicago suburbs, police found the bodies of 29 young men and boys. He'd buried them in the crawl space. When he ran out of room, he started dumping bodies in a nearby river. 33 victims total, most of them teenagers. The youngest was 14 years old. Gacy was arrested in 1978 after investigators started watching him following the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Peast. The boy had told his mother he was going to talk to Gacy about a construction job. He never came home. When police searched Gacy's property, the smell alone told them what they'd find. The trial didn't take long. Gacy's defense tried to argue insanity. The jury wasn't buying it. He was sentenced to death in 1980. 14 years later, he was still alive, still appealing, still granting interviews where he showed no remorse. His last words? "Kiss my ass." The execution itself became controversial. The chemicals didn't flow properly through the IV line. It took 18 minutes for Gacy to die, much longer than planned. Witnesses said he appeared to be choking. Prison officials had to stop the procedure, fix the equipment, and start again. Outside the prison, hundreds gathered. When news of his death was announced, people cheered and set off fireworks. Gacy was 52 years old. He'd spent more than half his life knowing he would die for what he'd done. And when the day finally came, even the execution went wrong. But why did it take 14 years? Between sentencing and execution, Gacy filed appeal after appeal. The courts reviewed his case multiple times. This wasn't unusual. The gap between Bundy's execution and Gacy's showed how the legal system had slowed down. More reviews, more delays, more waiting. For the families of those 33 victims, 14 years felt like forever. One more killer would face execution by the state. But her story? Completely different from these two. October 9th, 2002. Florida State Prison. 9:47 a.m. Aileen Wuornos became the second woman executed in Florida since 1976. The same state that had executed Ted Bundy 13 years earlier. The same prison. The same method. Lethal injection. But Wuornos wanted to die. Between 1989 and 1990, she shot and killed 7 men along Florida highways. She worked as a prostitute, and she claimed every one of those men had tried to rape her or hurt her. Self-defense, she said. But investigators found problems with her story. The evidence didn't match. Some of the men were shot multiple times. She robbed them all, taking their cars, their money, their belongings. The jury convicted her of 6 murders. She was sentenced to death. At first, Wuornos fought the sentence. She appealed. She gave interviews claiming innocence. Then something changed. In her final years on death row, she stopped fighting. She fired her lawyers. She demanded Florida carry out her execution. She said she wanted to die. She said she couldn't take being in prison anymore. In her last interview, days before her death, she appeared erratic. She talked about being tortured through the prison walls, about conspiracies, about wanting it all to end. Some people questioned whether she was mentally fit to be executed. The courts said yes. The execution moved forward. Her final words were brief. She said she'd be back, like in the movie Independence Day, referencing the aliens returning. Then she said she was sailing at the rock, and that she'd be back like Jesus to condemn everyone. At 9:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead. She was 46 years old. Wuornos remains one of the most debated cases on this list. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a damaged woman who'd suffered abuse her entire life and finally snapped? Her childhood was horrific. Her teenage years were worse. By the time she started killing, she'd been living on the streets for years. None of that excused what she did, but it explained why so many people still argue about whether her execution was justice or something else entirely. 3 killers executed by the state. Bundy in the electric chair, Gacy and Wuornos by lethal injection, all 3 convicted. All 3 dead. But not every killer on this list made it to the execution chamber. Some died in prison before the state could finish what it started. November 28, 1994. Columbia Correctional Institution, Wisconsin. Morning work detail. Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to clean the prison bathroom along with 2 other inmates. One of them was Jesse Anderson, a man convicted of killing his wife. The other was Christopher Scarver, serving a life sentence for murder. Less than 20 minutes later, Dahmer was dead. Scarver had beaten him with a 20-inch metal bar from the prison weight room. The attack was brutal. Dahmer's skull was crushed. Anderson was also attacked and died 2 days later from his injuries. When guards found them, it was already too late for Dahmer. He was 34 years old. He'd been in prison less than 3 years. This was the man who had terrorized Milwaukee. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer killed 17 young men and boys. What he did to them after death made him one of the most disturbing killers in American history. He dismembered bodies. He kept body parts in his apartment. He photographed everything. When police finally entered his apartment in July 1991, they found photographs, severed heads in the refrigerator, and a barrel filled with acid and decomposing remains. The responding officer said the smell was unbearable. Dahmer confessed to everything. He pled guilty but insane. The jury rejected the insanity defense. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, no possibility of parole. Wisconsin had abolished the death penalty in 1853, so execution wasn't an option. That meant Dahmer would spend the rest of his life in prison. At first, he was kept in solitary confinement for his own protection. Prison officials knew what happened to killers like him in general population. Other inmates hated him. Death threats came constantly. But after a year, Dahmer requested to be moved into general population. He said he didn't want to be isolated anymore. The request was granted. Christopher Scarver later said he'd been disgusted by Dahmer. He claimed Dahmer would make his food look like severed limbs and use ketchup to simulate blood, taunting other inmates. Scarver said he'd asked prison staff to never leave him alone with Dahmer. On November 28th, a guard left the 3 men unsupervised in the bathroom. Scarver saw his opportunity. He attacked Dahmer first, then Anderson. He later told investigators that God had told him to do it. He showed no remorse. He was already serving life, so additional charges wouldn't change his situation much. For Dahmer's father, the death brought complicated feelings. He'd visited his son in prison, hoping he'd found some form of redemption. Dahmer had supposedly become religious, reading the Bible, meeting with a minister. Whether that was genuine or another manipulation, no one will ever know. The families of Dahmer's victims had mixed reactions. Some felt relief. Others felt cheated, that he'd avoided a long life behind bars. A few said they'd wanted him to suffer longer. Prison officials faced criticism. Why were these 3 inmates left alone? Why wasn't Dahmer protected better? An investigation followed, but the damage was done. Dahmer's death showed something that would repeat in these cases. Sometimes the state doesn't get to decide when a killer dies. Sometimes other inmates make that choice instead. But Dahmer wasn't the last killer who'd die waiting for his execution. June 7, 2013. Marin General Hospital, California. 9 a.m. Richard Ramirez died in his hospital bed, handcuffed and shackled, with prison guards standing nearby. He'd been transferred from San Quentin State Prison's death row after his health collapsed. The cause of death was complications from B-cell lymphoma, a form of blood cancer. He also had chronic hepatitis C. He was 53 years old. He'd been on death row for 23 years. The state of California never got to execute him. This was the Night Stalker, the man who terrorized Southern California in 1984 and 1985. He broke into homes in the middle of the night. He killed men, women, and children. He raped, he mutilated, he spray-painted pentagrams on walls. 13 confirmed murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. His victims ranged from a 6-year-old girl to an 83-year-old woman. He had no pattern, no type, no preference. Anyone could be a target. The fear he created was enormous. People in Los Angeles stopped sleeping with their windows open, even in the summer heat. They installed new locks. They bought guns. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Ramirez was finally caught in August 1985 when his face was plastered across newspapers and television. A group of residents in East Los Angeles recognized him and chased him down, beating him before police arrived. When officers pulled him away from the crowd, he was begging them for protection. His trial lasted over a year. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to death. 19 death sentences, in fact. One for each capital murder. The judge told him he'd die in the gas chamber. Ramirez smiled. He said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory." But California's death penalty moved slowly. Very slowly. Appeals stretched on for years. Ramirez sat on death row at San Quentin, where he received fan mail from women who claimed to love him. One of them, Doreen Lioy, married him in 1996 while he was in prison. The marriage lasted until 2009. Throughout his time in prison, Ramirez showed no remorse. He gave interviews where he talked about Satan and evil. He flashed pentagram symbols drawn on his palm. He seemed to enjoy the attention, the infamy. Then his health started failing. The hepatitis C went untreated for years. The cancer developed. By 2013, he was dying and there was nothing the state could do about it. When news of his death reached the families of his victims, reactions varied. Some felt robbed. They'd waited nearly 3 decades to see him executed. They wanted him to face the gas chamber, to know the exact moment his life would end. The way their loved ones had known terror in their final moments. Others felt relief. He was gone. That was enough. Ramirez's death highlighted a growing problem in California. The state had one of the largest death row populations in the country, but executions had essentially stopped. Legal challenges, drug shortages, and political opposition meant inmates were dying of old age or illness before the state could carry out their sentences. For Ramirez, death came naturally. He avoided the execution chamber entirely, but there was one killer on this list who died long before the modern death penalty debates, a killer from a different era entirely. January 16, 1936, Sing Sing Prison, New York. 11:06 p.m. Albert Fish walked to the electric chair at age 65. He was calm. Some witnesses said he appeared almost eager. When guards strapped him in, he helped them adjust the electrodes. He made no final statement. At 11:06 p.m., the executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts surged through Fish's body. It took 3 attempts before he was pronounced dead. Some claimed the metal pins Fish had inserted into his own body over the years interfered with the electricity, but prison officials denied this. Albert Fish was dead. The state of New York had executed one of the most deranged killers in American history. Fish confessed to at least 5 child murders, though he claimed the number was closer to 100. Investigators believed the real count was somewhere in between, possibly around 15 confirmed victims. His crimes went back decades, spanning multiple states. What made Fish particularly horrifying wasn't the number of victims, it was what he did. He was a sadist who tortured children. He wrote letters to the families of his victims, describing in graphic detail what he'd done. One of those letters led to his arrest. In 1928, Fish abducted a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd from her home in New York. He'd gained the family's trust. Pretending to be a kind old man offering a job to Grace's older brother. Instead, he took Grace to an abandoned house and killed her. 6 years later, he sent a letter to Grace's mother. The contents were so disturbing, that when police finally tracked him down through the letter stationery, they knew they had their man. Fish's trial in 1935 became a media sensation. The prosecution presented evidence of his crimes. The defense argued insanity. Psychiatrists examined him and found he had numerous mental disorders. He'd been inserting needles into his body for years. X-rays showed at least 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region. He claimed it brought him pain, and pain brought him pleasure. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty. The judge sentenced him to death. Fish spent his final months on death row at Sing Sing. He showed no fear of the electric chair. In fact, he told guards it would be the supreme thrill of my life. Whether he meant it or was simply trying to disturb people one last time, no one knew. His execution was carried out on schedule. No appeal succeeded. No delays granted. In 1936, the legal process moved much faster than it would decades later. When Fish died, newspapers called him the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. His crimes shocked a nation already struggling through the Great Depression. Parents became more protective. Children were warned about strangers more sternly. Fish had requested to be buried in a Catholic cemetery, despite his horrific crimes. His family honored that request, though the location of his grave was kept secret to prevent vandalism. His death marked the end of one of the earliest documented cases of a serial killer in American history. But decades later, researchers would look back at Fish's case and realize he'd been operating for years before anyone connected the disappearances. The next killer on this list avoided execution entirely, despite orchestrating some of the most infamous murders in American history. November 19, 2017, Mercy Hospital, Bakersfield, California. 8:13 p.m. Charles Manson died of cardiac arrest and colon cancer. He was 83 years old. He'd spent 46 years in prison, nearly half a century behind bars. He died of natural causes, in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical staff. He never faced an executioner. Manson didn't kill anyone himself. That's what made his case different. He orchestrated murders. He manipulated others to kill for him. In August 1969, members of his cult, known as the Manson family, broke into homes in Los Angeles and murdered 7 people over 2 nights. The most famous victim was actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. She was stabbed 16 times in her home, along with 4 others. The killers wrote messages on the walls in blood. The next night, Manson's followers killed Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their home, stabbing them repeatedly and leaving similar messages. The brutality shocked the nation. This wasn't random street crime. These were planned, coordinated attacks. And behind it all was Manson, a failed musician who'd built a following of young people willing to kill for him. Manson and several of his followers were arrested in late 1969. The trial began in 1970 and became a circus. Manson carved an X into his forehead. His followers did the same. They sang in the courthouse. They threatened witnesses. Manson tried to attack the judge. The jury convicted him of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to death in 1971, but he never made it to the gas chamber. In 1972, the California Supreme Court ruled the state's death penalty unconstitutional. Every inmate on death row, including Manson, had their sentences automatically reduced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. That possibility meant Manson had parole hearings. 12 of them, in fact, between 1978 and 2012. He was denied every single time. His behavior in prison made it clear he hadn't changed. He gave interviews where he showed no remorse. He rambled. He made bizarre statements. He became a symbol of evil in American culture. Over the decades, Manson's infamy grew. Documentaries were made. Books were written. His face became recognizable worldwide. He received more mail than almost any other inmate in California. Some of it was from people who supported him, who saw him as some kind of countercultural figure. By the 2000s, Manson's health declined. He was elderly, still in prison, still denied parole. In 2017, he was hospitalized multiple times. Prison officials kept the details private, but it was clear his body was failing. When he died in November, the reactions were mixed. Some people felt justice had been served by keeping him locked up for life. Others felt frustrated that he'd avoided execution, that he'd lived into old age when his victims never had that chance. Sharon Tate's sister, Deborah Tate, had spent decades attending Manson's parole hearings to ensure he stayed behind bars. When Manson died, she said it brought no closure. The pain remained. After Manson's death, a bizarre legal battle erupted over his body and his estate. Multiple people claimed they had rights to his remains. It took months to resolve. He was eventually cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. Manson's death highlighted something unusual about the American justice system. A man sentenced to death in 1971 died of natural causes in 2017, never facing execution. Changes in law, appeals, and parole hearings meant he lived far longer than anyone expected. But if Manson's case seemed complicated, the final killer on this list has an even stranger story. Because his case goes back over a century, to an era when serial murder wasn't even a term people used. 8 serial killers, 8 different endings. Some faced the ultimate punishment from the state. Others avoided it through legal changes or their own deaths. One was murdered in prison. One lived to old age despite a death sentence. What does that tell us? Maybe that justice isn't consistent. Maybe that the system has changed over time, becoming slower, more deliberate, more complicated. Maybe that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. Like a prison bathroom where an inmate decides to take matters into his own hands. Or maybe it tells us that focusing on how killers died misses the point entirely. They're gone. Their victims are still gone too. And the families of those victims are still living with the aftermath. The debates will continue. Should the death penalty exist? Is life in prison more humane? Do killers deserve quick deaths or decades of suffering behind bars? Those are questions society keeps asking with no clear consensus. But here's what's not debatable. These 8 people committed horrific crimes. They destroyed lives. They caused immeasurable pain. And eventually, one way or another, they all died. Their legacies remain. Their names are still known. Their crimes are still studied. But their days of causing harm ended, whether by the state's hand, another prisoner's violence, or simply time running out. So let me know in the comments. Do you think any of these killers got the ending they deserved?